The frayed edges of dusk settled over the valley as Miriam Hebden followed the crooked path toward the old chapel. Weeds rattled at her ankles, and the wind carried a faint keening sound, like a hymn sung off-key in the cold. Long had she heard rumors of the ruin nestled among the gnarled trees, of its stained glass windows that gleamed more red than any rose, and of the curse rumored to have befallen the choir that once gave life to its walls. Most travelers ignored these stories, dismissing them as ancient superstition. But Miriam was drawn to the place against every instinct of self-preservation she felt. Something in those legends whispered, with an intensity she couldn't ignore. Each breath of night air drummed against her chest, urging her to turn away. Yet onward she went, compelled by the unrelenting pull of the unknown. She crossed a threshold of rust-choked gates. Beyond them, the old chapel rose in jagged silhouette, its once majestic steeple snapped in half by centuries of storms. Vines clung to its stone walls like skeletal arms. The large stained glass windows that remained intact were rimmed in intricate patterns of swirling color. Beneath the cloak of twilight, they glowed faintly, as though a dying ember still burned within. Miriam paused in the courtyard, uncertain if her eyes betrayed her. For a brief moment it seemed the windows flowed with a dark, luminous sheen, a glimmer of crimson reflected in the glass. Then it disappeared, leaving her breathless. The chapel's doors groaned and scraped as she pushed against them, flakes of rotted wood splintering with the effort. A stale odor, thick with mold and hidden decay, billowed outward. It choked the air, forcing Miriam to raise her coat sleeve to her nose. Around her, inside, the pews leaned at drunken angles. Shattered shards of color lay strewn across the floor from the windows that had not survived the ravages of time. The half-moon's pale light filtered through the remaining glass, casting eerie patterns across the flagstones. High overhead, rafters sagged like tired shoulders. The hush was total. No rustling of bats, no scuttling of rats, nothing but her own blood thrumming in her ears. She closed the door behind her and advanced further into the gloom, her footsteps sending up puffs of dust. Rotted hymnals lay scattered along the pews, page edges curling with age. Arranged upon a raised dais near the rear of the chapel, an abandoned choir stall beckoned. Miriam could almost imagine the once devout congregation standing there in somber lines, raising their voices in song. The quiet was so profound that when she moved to a side alcove, even the rustle of her coat seemed an intrusion. She felt a sudden chill, and her heart pounded at the idea of crossing into a place so utterly forsaken. She recalled a passage from one of the old local texts she had discovered in the library. It spoke of a final service centuries ago, after which the entire choir had vanished. Some said they had angered a spirit lurking beneath the chapel's foundation. Others insisted they had joined in some dark ritual. All that remained were the scarlet tears the windows supposedly shed whenever the cursed choir raised their voices one last time. Nobody could explain how the glass bled, or if it was truly blood that trickled in lines down the panes. But the villagers' stories were resolute on one point. Whenever anyone dared remain in the chapel at night, they heard music resonate through the walls, as though the choir was conducting its final performance in an endless loop. Miriam lingered by a twisted candelabrum, her breath catching in her throat. A hush enveloped the space, dense and almost alive. She caught sight of an ancient pulpit, carved from a dark wood that wore deep Gothic reliefs, swirling into a swirl of barbed vines and cherub faces. Who had shaped those carvings, and why such unsettling patterns? She climbed the steps onto the dais. The boards groaned ominously beneath her weight, but they held. She found herself standing at the choir's vantage point, staring down at the pews and the aisle that stretched to the entrance. The chapel looked like a giant mouth from this angle, its collapsed dome overhead like a hollowed skull, the stained glass windows lined either side dulled by ages of dust and neglect. She thought she saw her reflection in one of them, but the shape wavered, as if something else peered through from the other side. Her pulse spiked. She spun toward the dark corner of the dais, where a grand decaying organ stood. The instrument's pipes soared upward, many choked with spider webs and grime, others bent and broken. The keys, she imagined, must be brittle. Yet something about the organ called to her, enticing her to approach. She stepped carefully over the crumbling floorboards, coming to stand beside the mildewed bench. It carried the distinct odor of rot, but no creatures scurried away at her arrival. The bench was as silent and still as a crypt. Hesitating, she reached out, fingertip brushing the keys. A single, muffled note sounded, deep as a muffled heartbeat. The reverberations traveled through the chapel walls, stirring dust from the rafters. Unsure whether it was the echo or some intangible presence, she felt a ripple of tension. Suddenly, a cold breeze whispered across her neck. She glanced over her shoulder. The chapel door remained tightly closed, yet the air felt alive now, charged. One of the windows flared with deep garnet color via the moonlight, flickering as though something moved behind the glass. She carefully walked to the nearest window. Its images had once depicted a scene of saints and angels, but time had cracked their faces and the color had partially faded. She touched a missing piece, noticing the ragged edge was stained a darker hue. It might have been the residue of centuries of rain and dirt, or perhaps something else. Her mind drifted back to the local tales, the cursed choir singing their final psalms, bringing the windows to weep. Did that phenomenon require living witnesses to enact it? Miriam exhaled shakily, turning away from the window. She felt the creeping weight of the chapel's presence, a heaviness that had no tangible source. The gloom seemed to press in. Then, faint at first but growing in clarity, came the resonance of voices. They drifted from unseen corners, chanting a melody so sad and solemn she could almost feel the sorrow vibrating in her bones. The choir had returned to sing its final psalms, or at least, the echoes of that final performance lingered. Miriam's eyes widened as the voices rose in pristine harmony, their words not quite Latin, nor any language she recognized. The stained glass windows quivered under the force of the notes. Dust drifted from overhead. A wave of prickling fear brushed her spine, yet some part of her felt compelled to stay and listen, drawn by the otherworldly beauty and horror in equal measure. As the voices swelled in crescendo, she noticed, with mounting terror, that one of the windows streaked red. A single line of deep crimson trickled down the glass, meandering in uncertain rivulets, as though from a fresh wound. She blinked, certain she was hallucinating. But seconds later, another window, then another, began to bleed. The droplets shimmered maroon in the moonlight, reflecting in bright, wet lines as they cascaded onto the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared in disbelief at the impossible sight of glass windows weeping blood. The choir's voices rose higher, overwhelming her senses. Terrified, but unable to tear her eyes away, Miriam approached the closest weeping pane. The liquid continued to run in delicate threads, collecting in sticky pools at the windowsill. She dared to touch it. Warm and thick, it clung to her fingertip with a tang of iron. Her stomach lurched. She stumbled backward, clutching her hand to her coat as though wanting to hide the evidence of this abomination. The voices chanted on, their hymns swimming like a dreadful lullaby inside her mind. Desperate to halt the singing, she gazed up to the choir stall. She saw shapes that had not been there before. Dim outlines, figures, cloaked in tattered choir robes, stood in formation, as if preparing for one final mass. Their faces were pale as moonlight, their vacant eyes reflecting the faint red glow bleeding through the windows. She wanted to scream, but her voice stayed lodged in her throat. A leaden hush fell before the choir voices resumed. The shapes swayed in unison, their mouths opening without oxygen, chanting an ink-black psalm. They seemed half there, half somewhere else, suspended by the centuries between life and death. Her limbs tingled with fear, but a strange fascination stirred within her, compelling her to approach. The congregation of ghosts turned their hollow stares toward Miriam, as if beckoning her to join them. Eyes wide, she sank to her knees behind a pew, clutching the splintered wood for solace. The hymn escalated, pushing the limits of pitch until it threatened to shatter every bit of glass in the chapel, and indeed, the windows reverberated vibrations that jangled Miriam's teeth. Yet they did not break. They bled more profusely, so that rivulets pooled in small crimson lakes on the floor. In that moment, memory flashed through Miriam's mind. As a child, she and her mother had sat in a quiet, warm church, the organ's gentle chords cradling them. She remembered the hush of prayer, the soft hush that spoke of faith and comfort. Now, that memory felt perverted, twisted by the unholy atmosphere that loomed around her. There was no comfort in this hymnal tapestry, only dread, despair, and an otherworldly sorrow that made her soul quake. Determined to stop the spectacle, to break free from the trance, she rose shakily to her feet. The presence of the silent watchers, the choir's lingering spirits, pressed in, suffocating her with their silent demands. Every fiber of her being screamed for escape, yet she knew intuitively that running would solve nothing. The story she had read indicated that once the cursed choir appeared, their final hymn had to be completed, or the restless ghosts would be trapped, doomed to repeat the same lament until the end of time. Perhaps that was the impetus for the window's red tears. The sorrow uncontained, yearning for release. Her chest tight, she forced herself forward step by step, up the dais once more. The spectral choir parted slightly, enough for her to pass through to the organ. Sucking in a breath, she lowered herself onto the bench. The wooden seat sagged but did not collapse. The chanting continued, swirling around her in a morbid lull. She tentatively placed her fingers on the keys. The moment she pressed down, a chord resounded, a deep moan that shook more dust from the rafters. Each dissonant note resonated through the stone walls, weaving into the choir's unholy refrain. The ghosts, their eyes fixed on Miriam, sang with renewed vigor, their voices drilled into her skull. Her fingers moved involuntarily, gliding over the keys with surprising skill, though she had not touched an organ since her earliest childhood lessons. The organ's sound was wet, as though clogged with echoes of centuries past, but it mingled with the voices seamlessly, weaving a melody both haunting and radiant. If the darkness could find beauty, it did so in this twisted psalm. The swirling combination of organ and unearthly choir threatened to unravel Miriam's mind, but she pressed on, feeling a strange power surge in her limbs. With every chord, the red tears on the windows increased, dripping onto the floor in greater streams. The choir's faces hollowed further, their robes reduced to ragged shadows. They sang of longing for release, of centuries spent in limbo. Miriam felt an ache pierce her heart as she became a vessel for their sorrow, channeling it through the organ's battered pipes. She saw in her mind's eye how the final service had turned dark, how an ambitious choirmaster dabbled in forbidden rites, chanting blasphemous lines that lured a sleeping demon from the chapel's foundation. The demon's presence shattered reality for those devout souls, binding them to an eternal penance. As if reading her memories, the spectral choir turned to face the windows. Their voices dropped to a whisper, a hush that carried within it the weight of centuries. On a final chord, Miriam felt the entire chapel vibrate from the floor to the highest rafters. The windows rattled, but did not shatter. Instead, the blood-red rivulets began to swirl, as if guided by an unseen hand, coalescing into rivulets that stretched across the glass like spidery webs. Suddenly, the tallest of the apparitions, the choirmaster, stepped forward. His face was contorted in unspeakable agony, and he lifted a hand toward Miriam. She faltered on the keys, nearly losing the chord. The ghost's voice rang out above the rest, a final invocation for redemption, or perhaps condemnation. She could not name it, only feel the devastating grief and doom in every note. His lips parted, and a silent scream seared the air. The organ thundered under Miriam's shaking hands, the entire structure groaning in protest, as if the demons slumbering below the chapel's foundation were stirring once again. Compelled by something beyond rational thought, Miriam closed her eyes. She let her hands fall in a furious sequence of chords that soared upward, culminating in a chord so resonant that it sent her heart fluttering. The choir answered with a final chorus, voices rising together in perfect, sorrowful unison. In that moment, time seemed to warp. The color from the windows flooded outward, illuminating the entire chapel in vibrant red. The ghostly singers glowed in the eerie luminescence, their forms becoming more distinct and somehow more tragically human. With one final note, the chanting stopped. The organ's echo reverberated off the stone walls, drifting into a pregnant silence. Miriam opened her eyes, beads of cold sweat on her brow, and saw the choir vanish like smoke rising into the still air. Slowly, the bleeding windows ceased their crimson flow, leaving behind only sticky puddles and streaks like runnels of tears. The hush that followed was startling in its stillness. She could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. She sat at the organ bench, breath ragged. The ghosts had vanquished the last of their impossible lullabies. Had they found peace? She sensed that their final psalm had severed the cursed loop. But the presence beneath the chapel had been awakened, if only briefly, and she felt a faint tremor run through the flagstones. She sensed that some malevolent force had been appeased, but not destroyed. It only slept, dreamless and quiet, until the next daring soul ventured too far into the darkness. Miriam wondered if that fate would be hers, but the silence in her heart told her that the ghosts had chosen to spare her. In the gloom, she slowly rose and made her way to the front doors. Her feet splashed in warm puddles near the windows, each step leaving a damp footprint on the worn stones. The taste of iron lingered in the air. Her agitation built again, as though returning to face the living world would demand a toll. Yet, as she angled around a shattered pew, a soft glow caught her eye. She turned, glimpsing a single candle burning on the altar, an impossibility in a place so long abandoned. The tiny flame sputtered as though it might go out at any moment, yet it held, a lone survivor against the swallowing darkness. She knew this meant something, perhaps a sign that the choir's final act was complete, that a spark of grace had re-entered the chapel. Approaching the door, she hesitated. A drip of scarlet from the stone arch landed near her foot, startling her. She glanced up, but the windows were no longer bleeding, and no more shapes lurked among the pews. The illusions, or spirits, were gone. Her hand found the rung of the door's handle. A wave of nauseating relief washed over her, a whirl of fear and triumph colliding in her chest. Was the chapel truly at peace, or simply sated in its hunger for mortal souls? Outside, the night wind whipped across her face. She stepped from the threshold onto the overgrown path. The moon had risen higher, painting the broken steeple in pale silver. She paused at the iron gates, glancing back at the ruin. In the gloom, the stained glass windows looked black, no longer illuminated from within. She told herself it was over, that the curse had ended, but the hush of the night offered no comfort. She felt unsettled, as though she carried a piece of that final song within her. Even now, if she listened closely, she could sense that subtle, barely audible hum of the unholy psalm echoing in her mind. She pressed on, moving away from the chapel, the silhouette vanishing behind the twisted branches. But the memory lingered, as vivid as if etched in blood and glass upon her vision. She wondered how she could ever describe the experience to anyone else. Could the ordinary world even comprehend such horror, such sorrowful beauty? She doubted it. Perhaps it was better this way, a secret kept between the chapel and her soul. At length, she reached a crossroads in the wood. The path diverged left, leading back to the faint lights of the village, and right, winding deeper into an uncharted wilderness. She paused, the wind tugging at her coat. A subtle whisper brushed her ear, reminiscent of the final note from the cursed. She looked over her shoulder toward the distant black line of trees that concealed the chapel. Perhaps it was a breeze, or perhaps something else. A stray chord from that unholy organ echoing across the miles, bidding her farewell. She turned left, back toward the flickering torches of civilization, breath uneven. Yet every few paces her thoughts drifted behind her, picturing again those crimson tears sliding down the stained glass, the ghostly figures longing for release. They had been freed from the demon's clutches, at least for now, but she suspected the demon's hunger remained. She recalled the stories of travelers who vanished, never to be seen again. The chapel might rest for a time, waiting silently for the next curious soul who could not resist its macabre allure. Dark clouds drifted across the moon. In that shifting twilight, Miriam's foot caught on a jutting root, and she pitched forward. Catching herself against the trunk of a birch tree, she uttered a strained laugh, half delirious with relief to be alive. Straightening, she forced herself onward, each step guiding her closer to safety, though she felt uncertain if true safety existed anymore. The hush of the night was broken only by the chirp of distant crickets and the hush of wind in the branches. Eventually she glimpsed the glow of lanterns, where the old trail met a broader road, near the outskirts of the village. A local farmer had once told her that the chapel stories were merely old wives' tales, spun to frighten children. She felt a bitter taste in her mouth at that thought now. She alone knew the reality of those legends, carried them in her bones. She would never again look at a stained glass window without recalling the night she had watched them bleed. As she neared the cluster of dwellings, she stifled the urge to run. She had the distinct feeling that if she broke into a sprint, the entire memory would chase her, threatening to devour her mind. Instead, she forced her feet to remain at a steady pace, crossing the threshold into the circle of lamplight. No one was around at this hour to witness her arrival. In the silence, she straightened her coat, noticing for the first time that her sleeve was still stained dark with dried blood. A tremor passed through her. What might the villagers say if they saw her thus? She crept back to her modest lodging, shoulders hunched. Inside, she locked the door and shuttered the windows. She removed her coat with shaking hands, stepping into the quiet hush of an almost comforting darkness. It should have felt safe, but the gloom reminded her of the defiled sanctuary. Taking a candle, she sat at a small table and stared into the flame, trying to banish the images that haunted her. The final chord of that cursed hymn reverberated within her ears, a horrifying lullaby that promised the demon's presence still lingered, waiting behind the edges of the world. Sleep came in disjointed fragments. She dreamed of drifting through the chapel's nave, the windows weeping torrents of blood so thick she was nearly swept away. The choir chanted their final psalm, but this time their mouths stretched wider and wider until nothing but darkness remained. She awoke to the pre-dawn hush, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. The nightmares made her question her own sanity. Perhaps it was all madness, a dreadful illusion conjured by some longing for the supernatural. She did not truly believe that. She tasted the iron on her lips, and she knew it had been real. In the following days, her thoughts drifted to the lonely ruin, and a sense of profound dread commingled with pity for the souls trapped there for so long. She wondered if the walls would remain quiet now. She thought of the streaks of blood that had stained the floors. Had the earth swallowed them? Or would they remain as a grotesque testament to the final liturgy? When travelers in the village mentioned the old chapel, she bit her tongue. Better to let the chapel's darkness remain a legend. Better for the curious to avoid it altogether. Yet sometimes, in the small hours of the morning, she caught herself humming the edges of that deviant tune. The memory haunted her, beckoning her to return. Though she fought the urge, she knew that part of her spirit had been claimed by the place. The cursed choir had finished their final psalm, but their voices still echoed in her memory. She carried their lament like a secret brand on her soul, a reminder that ancient evils did not fade simply because their last verse had been sung. She made a vow never to set foot inside that unholy chapel again, no matter how compelling the call. Some traps are best left sealed. Some songs, once sung, must not be repeated. Even if the windows never again bled red, the memory of their crimson tears would remain. And so she lived in quiet watchfulness, each day a fragile barrier against the lingering chords of that dreadful hymn, aware that the boundary between safety and madness could be shattered as easily as the delicate stained glass, if only by the strengthening hush of a single note too tempting to resist.